Hey everyone. All right, so today we're going to be talking a little bit about the nervous system. So we're going to get into some introductory material and just talk about how the tissue works and what it does for your body. All right, so first of all, the nervous system, the main role that this plays is communication, detection. So receiving signals from the outside world, so from outside your body, also receiving signals from inside your body, communicating those signals to your brain, and then your brain then responds to those signals appropriately. So there's a lot of communication, a lot of information going back and forth, and that's the whole job of your nervous system is to keep different parts of your body connected so they're communicating well together. Um, so in order to have this kind of communication work, the tissue needs to be excitable. So we talked about excitable tissue last week when we were talking about the muscle cells being able to carry that electrical charge and send electrical signals along the surface of the cell. Nervous cells work in a very, very similar way, right? So we can have that action potential, that movement of charge across the surface of the cell and that charge can even sometimes move from one cell to the next. All right, so general divisions of the nervous system. We're going to divide your nervous system into two main parts. The two main parts are the central nervous system, which consists of just the brain and the spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system, which is everything else. So peripheral nervous system includes all the spinal nerves that branch off your spinal cord, and also all the cranial nerves that branch off the bottom of your brain. All right, so brain and spinal cord is central. Every other nerve in your body is considered peripheral nervous system. All right. Now we can further divide the peripheral nervous system into different portions. So we have the somatic nervous system. So anytime you see somatic, soma is another word for body. So this is the nervous system that's associated with body movement. So your somatic nervous system has a lot to do with motor. Your autonomic nervous system, that's kind of, when you think autonomic, think automatic. The words sound very similar. So autonomic nervous system controls like internal workings of your body that you don't normally have conscious control over. And then the enteric nervous system, which is controlling digestion. All right, so again, divisions of the peripheral nervous system. One of the main ones, and one we're going to spend a lot of time on, is the somatic nervous system. So again, somatic refers to the nervous system associated with body movements. So two major important components of the somatic nervous system, and those are sensory pathways. So sensory pathways are pathways that are going towards the brain. A lot of times we refer to pathways towards the brain as being afferent with an A. And then their counterpart would be efferent pathways or motor pathways. Those are signals that are leaving the brain and going to various places in the body. So sensory is always going in towards the brain. Motor is always going out away from the brain. So that's the directionality of that movement. So afferent is towards central nervous system. Efferent is away from the central nervous system. And then usually there's an interneuron going to be involved here. So an interneuron is a neuron that's usually inside the central nervous system, so either in your brain or in your spinal cord, that's going to connect the afferent and the efferent pathway. So you'll have an afferent signal coming in, it's going to transfer that signal to an interneuron. The interneuron will decide what to do with that signal and then send an efferent pathway back out as a response to that afferent signal that came in. All right, and then the autonomic nervous system, which again, this one is kind of, consider this the nervous system that's controlling a lot of things that are not under conscious control. So things like how quickly your heart is beating, your respiratory rate, how food is being moved through your digestive tract. So there's a lot of internal control happening with this autonomic nervous system. And again, we can subdivide the autonomic nervous system into two different components, and those are going to be the parasympathetic division and the sympathetic division, right? And each of those are going to have different jobs. All right, and then on to the enteric nervous system here. So again, enteric refers to the gut. So this is nerves that are associated with digestion. And that's everything from ingestion, taking the food in, all the way to breaking the food down, digestion, absorption, bringing the food into the bloodstream, and then excretion of wastes out the other side. All right, so here's an overall kind of flow chart that I thought was sort of useful since we are going to be talking about the nervous system for the next couple weeks until the end of the term here. It's going to be good to refer back to this flow chart pretty often to remind yourself what we're talking about. So again, the entire nervous system can be subdivided into either central or peripheral. Central is going to be brain and spinal cord. Peripheral is going to be everything outside of the brain and spinal cord. So our first major division of the peripheral nervous system is going to be between autonomic and somatic. If we're talking about the somatic nervous system, then we can subdivide that into motor and sensory. If we're talking about the autonomic nervous system, then we subdivide that into sympathetic and parasympathetic. So I know it sounds like a lot, and it's kind of probably just a jumble of words right now. But keep referring back to this chart, and I think it'll be helpful as we progress through the next few units of material here. Okay, so let's get back to the basics here and talk about the cells of the nervous system. So way back when we were talking about different types of tissues, I think in Unit 2, we mentioned that nervous tissue has neurons, which are the actual excitable cells that are sending electrical signals. And then we also have neuroglia, sometimes just called glial cells. Those neuroglia are the support cells. These are the guys that are helping the neurons do their job. And there are many different types of glia. So it's not just one cell category. There are actually several different types of glia. All right, so neuroglia altogether have a whole bunch of different jobs in your nervous system. So one, the neuroglia, a certain type of neuroglia forms your blood-brain barrier. So you might have heard of the blood-brain barrier before. So this is an extra layer of protection that helps prevent toxins getting from their bloodstream into your brain, right? So that blood-brain barrier is formed by some of your glial cells. Your neuroglia are also responsible for building the myelin sheath, and we'll talk about what that is in a minute. It's basically insulation around your nerves that allows electrical signals to move more quickly. Your neuroglia also make cerebrospinal fluid. So cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF there in your slides, is a fluid that kind of bathes the brain and bathes the spinal cord to help keep those tissues kind of cushioned and also nourished. And then we also have some neuroglia cells that are important for phagocytosis. So should any pathogens, viruses, bacteria, things like that make their way into the nervous system, then we need to have specialized cells in the nervous system whose job it is to phagocytose those bad guys and get rid of them before they cause any damage. All right, so here are your main types of glial cells. All right, so the first type there is astrocytes. So astrocytes are only found in the central nervous system. It's mainly the astrocytes' job to produce that blood-brain barrier. So astrocytes kind of wrap themselves around the blood vessels in your brain, and they act as like an extra layer of protection so that anything nasty in the bloodstream is not necessarily going to seep out of those capillaries into your brain tissue. Right, so those are astrocytes. Oligodendrocytes are a type of neuroglial cell that produces the myelin sheaths in your central nervous system only. Right, so anywhere where we have this insulation around our axons, so this myelin fatty insulation, that's going to be produced by oligodendrocytes in the central nervous system. Now, we have a complementary cell to that in the peripheral nervous system, and those are called Schwann cells. So they both do the same job, right? And that's the production of the myelin sheath, but oligodendrocytes do that in the central nervous system, and Schwann cells do that in the peripheral nervous system, right? And then microglia. So microglia are cells that are basically like the phagocytes of your central nervous system. So microglia's job is to roam around looking for viruses, bacteria, toxins, anything that they can chew up and eat and help to protect your brain. And then ependymal cells. Ependymal cells are the ones who are responsible for producing cerebrospinal fluid. So they filter this fluid And then they are also responsible for circulating this fluid around the central nervous system. Right? So those 5 cell types there are the major different types of neuroglia that you have, in addition to the actual neurons, which are the ones responsible for sending and receiving messages. All right, so let's look at how that blood-brain barrier works real quick. All right, so here we've got, in this picture, we've got a cross section of a blood vessel. So in this blood vessel, you can see that, and this is a capillary, so a very small blood vessel. We've got blood going through the middle of that vessel, and we've got the kind of epithelial barrier that's sort of creating the barrier between the vessel and everything else. But then outside of that, we've got astrocytes, and the astrocytes are just creating an extra layer of protection so that anything nasty that might be flowing through that blood is not going to easily seep out of that capillary into your brain. Okay. Um, so this is one of the reasons why brain disorders are difficult to treat, because it's hard to get medicines into the brain, right? Because that blood-brain barrier does such a good job by creating tight junctions of the cells around those capillaries that stuff that's in the bloodstream can't get out into the brain. So diseases like Parkinson's are tricky to treat because now we have to find drugs that not only treat the disease, but are also capable of getting to the brain tissue where it's going to be useful. All right, so for Parkinson's, for example, this is a disease that's caused by a decrease in the production of dopamine, which is one of your neurotransmitters. When you don't have enough dopamine, then we have trouble kind of sending messages in this part of the brain that controls movement. So as a treatment for Parkinson's, we have a chemical called levodopa, and that is a chemical that can actually cross the blood-brain barrier, and then once it crosses it, your brain converts it into dopamine. So this is the kind of like tricky stuff that we have to do in order to get drugs into the brain when necessary. Okay, a few questions before we move on. So of those, brain, sciatic nerve, retina, and spinal nerves, which one of those is in the central nervous system? And then next question, the support cells of your nerve tissue, are they called neurons, connective cells, neuroglia, fibroblasts, or neuroclasts? Think about it. All right, and the answer to the first one is brain. So the brain is the only one of those 4 choices that's in the central nervous system. Everything else listed there is considered to be peripheral nervous system. And then the support cells, of course, are called neuroglia. All right, so let's look at more of these neuroglia here. So next we'll look at the cells that form the myelin sheath. So myelin sheath, like I mentioned before, is just basically an insulation. It's like a covering that wraps itself around your nerves. And that insulation, think of it like how electrical cords are insulated, right? So you've got the actual part of the cord that's transmitting the electrical signal, and then we kind of wrap it in plastic, right? Or rubber or some sort of material to insulate it. And that's what the myelin does for your nerves. It's basically an insulation, which is going to allow that electrical signal to travel much more quickly down a nerve than it would in an uninsulated fiber. All right, so the 2 different types of cells that do this, again, are oligodendrocytes, perform this function in the central nervous system, and then Schwann cells perform this function in the peripheral nervous system. Right, so essentially, they just wrap themselves around an axon, which is the long part of a neuron that's actually transmitting the message. So they wrap themselves around an axon and create layer upon layer of this fatty substance. Essentially, it's phospholipids, right? So the phospholipids of the membranes of these cells are wrapping around the axon, and that's what produces the myelin sheath. Okay, there's kind of a better picture of it. So if you look at that kind of graphic at the top there, you can see the yellow part of this is representing the axon of a neuron. And that sort of light blue color is representing either the oligodendrocyte or the Schwann cell. And you can see how it's kind of wrapping itself around and around and around that axon. And as it wraps itself around, it's protecting it. So it's just creating layer upon layer of phospholipids. So we've got this kind of fatty, protective insulation around the axon of that neuron. And again, that's going to be important for speeding up the transmission of the electrical signal. Okay, so because axons can be really long and oligodendrocytes and Schwann cells are not typically that large, we have along the course of a long axon, so if my arm is the axon here, we'll have a Schwann cell wrapping around here, another one wrapping around here, and another one wrapping around here. But in between where those Schwann cells are, there are tiny little gaps. Right, so the tiny little gaps between the glial cells here, so whether they're Schwann cells or oligodendrocytes, those gaps are called nodes of Ranvier. So nodes of Ranvier are just gaps in the myelin sheath. And these gaps in the myelin sheath are actually places where the electrical signal can jump from one node of Ranvier to the next, to the next, to the next. And that's going to allow the signal to be transmitted much, much more quickly. All right, so again, myelin sheath is really important for speeding up the transmission of messages. The nodes of Ranvier are little gaps in between the myelin sheath. And then multiple sclerosis, which you may have heard of, is an autoimmune disease that results in the destruction of the myelin sheath. So you, once that myelin sheath starts to degrade, you can't really regenerate it. And so we start to slow down nervous signal transmission, which causes, as you can imagine, a lot of problems. Okay, all right, so looking at a whole neuron here. So we can see this neuron has a few different pieces and parts to it. So let's just remind ourselves of the parts of the neuron. So here we've got the soma, or the cell body. So that's the main body of the nerve cell. And in there, you're going to find the nucleus. You're going to find, all the normal things that you would find in a regular cell. So there's going to be the bulk of your organelles are going to be located in the soma, or the cell body. And then over here, we've got a whole bunch of dendrites. So dendrites are these little branching structures that are coming, kind of branching off of the cell body. So those dendrites are there to receive information. So information is always coming in through the dendrites. That information will then get transmitted from the dendrites through the cell body and then down the long axon here. So we can see once the information comes in here, it's going to go all the way down this axon. And some axons can be several feet long, right? So these axons can be very, very long cells, all the way down the axon until we reach the axon terminals. And so an axon terminal is where the neuron ends. Sometimes at the end of that axon terminal, you're going to find another nerve cell. Sometimes at the end of it, you'll find a muscle cell, as we talked about neuromuscular junctions last week. But the axon terminal is just where that particular neuron ends. Okay, so zoomed in on that axon terminal here a little bit, we can see the synaptic cleft. So we talked about synapses last week, but just to kind of refresh your memory here, remember that when we send a signal or an action potential, that action potential is going to travel down the axon here, and it's going to find its way to this axon terminal. And then inside the axon terminal here, in the terminal bulb, we have these vesicles. And the vesicles are going to be full of neurotransmitters. When we talked about this in the context of neuromuscular junctions, we said that the neurotransmitter was going to be acetylcholine for all of that kind of neuromuscular junction signal transmission. Your nervous system as a whole uses lots of different neurotransmitters. So there's probably 50 or more different neurotransmitters in your nervous system, and those again are just chemicals that are kept in little vesicles in the terminal bulbs here of the axons. When an action potential travels all the way to that terminal bulb, it's going to trigger the release of those vesicles. So we're going to perform exocytosis and release the contents of those vesicles into the synapse. And those chemical signals are then going to travel across the synapse and reach receptors on the other side of the synapse. So in this case, this picture we're looking at here has a connection between one neuron and another neuron. So this is where two neurons are coming together. So in this case, we refer to the first neuron here as the presynaptic neuron, so pre meaning before. And then the neuron down here that's receiving the information is the postsynaptic neuron, so post being after the synapse. So presynaptic is the one before the synapse, postsynaptic is the one after the synapse. right? And so ideally, when this signal is coming along, so action potential is traveling down the presynaptic neuron, it hits the terminal bulb there. It's going to release neurotransmitters into the synapse. Those neurotransmitters are going to float across the synapse until they trigger receptors on that postsynaptic neuron. And then that could possibly start another action potential in that postsynaptic neuron, and he'll continue to carry the message on to wherever it's going. Okay, so again, just a same picture here where we're looking at the synaptic vesicles. So again, the vesicles are little tiny bubbles that are inside the terminal bulb that are holding neurotransmitters. These neurotransmitters can be a lot of different types, but again, one of the main ones that we've already talked about is acetylcholine, which we use for a lot of your motor synapses. Okay. One other thing to just sort of refresh your memory about how an action potential works. So these action potentials, as they travel down the axon, when they reach that terminal bulb, it's going to cause some ion channels to open in that axon terminal, and that's going to allow calcium to rush into the cell. So in this picture here, all these little purple particles here are calcium ions that are rushing into the cell. And it's actually the calcium that comes into the cell that triggers the release of those synaptic vesicles that actually gets the neurotransmitter into the synapse. Okay. All right, so let's classify our neurons here a little bit. So we mentioned this before. We have neurons that are going toward the central nervous system, and then we've also got neurons that are going away from the central nervous system. So the ones that are going toward it are sensory neurons or afferent. So afferent is going towards the central nervous system. The ones that are going away from it are motor neurons, also called efferent neurons, and those are going away from the central nervous system. Okay, and then in between an afferent and an efferent neuron, we're usually going to find an interneuron. So an interneuron is sometimes called an association neuron. Both of those terms are interchangeable. And that's basically just like your integrator. He's receiving the message from the afferent neuron, deciding what to do with it, and then sending a message out an efferent neuron to respond to whatever that incoming signal was. All right, so a little bit of terminology here. So remember that neurons are a kind of interestingly shaped cell, in that we've got the cell body with a whole bunch of dendrites on it, and then we've got a long axon, which is like a tail coming off of the end. In places in your nervous system where we've got a whole bunch of cell bodies that are kind of closely associated with one another, so a big group of cell bodies all together, those could be called either ganglia or nuclei, depending on where we are in the nervous system. So if we're in the peripheral nervous system, a big group of cell bodies is called a ganglion. If we're in the central nervous system, a big group of cell bodies is called a nucleus, or nuclei would be plural. Right, so ganglia are groups of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. Nuclei are groups of cell bodies in the central nervous system. All right. Similarly, so if we have groups of cell bodies, you can kind of deduce that we also will have groups of axons that are kind of all bound together. A group of axons, or a big bundle of axons that are all bound together, that are all kind of traveling in the same direction, we call that a nerve. So, and we refer to it as a nerve if we've got that bundle of axons in the peripheral nervous system. If we've got a whole bundle of axons in the central nervous system, we refer to it as a tract. So a tract is in the central nervous system. A nerve is a bundle of axons in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, a quick note about regeneration of nervous tissue. So as you might expect, nervous tissue does not regenerate super easily. In fact, most of the time, once you lose a neuron, it's pretty much gone. So the neurons that you have are the ones that you were born with. They do not reproduce after birth, so they kind of lose that mitotic ability. So they can't be completely regenerated, but we can do some repair of certain neurons, but only in the peripheral nervous system. and only where we've got that where we've got heavily myelinated tissue. So you need the Schwann cells to help you repair any damaged axons in the peripheral nervous system. Again, this is not something that happens all the time. Usually, the regeneration of neurons is rare, if even happens at all. Right, yeah, so to do any regeneration, it has to be in the peripheral nervous system. The cell body has to be intact, and the part of the neuron that was damaged, which would be the axon in this case, has to be myelinated so that that Schwann cell can help repair it, right? So, and then we mentioned a little bit earlier the process of demyelination, how demyelination can be caused by a lot of things. So autoimmune disease like multiple sclerosis, and also from certain medical treatments. Sometimes radiation or chemo can damage myelin sheaths on certain nerves. And when that happens, the nerve underneath that myelin is going to start to deteriorate, and messages are not going to be able to be sent as quickly back and forth. So you'll lose some of the function of that nerve. Okay, so question one here, what kind of neurons carry information towards the central nervous system? And then question two, what kind of neurons carry information away from the central nervous system? All right, and if you said afferent carry towards and efferent carry away, then you're correct. All right, so I hope this was a helpful little introduction to the nervous system, and we'll talk more as we get into more detail about how all this works.